Yeah. Thank you very much. Um, so, a testimony is sort of interesting because through the year, now I've been a Christian since 1973, just short of my 16th birthday. And I will go into the detail of how that occurred. Typically, when I try to share my faith with somebody, I'll use a more abbreviated testimony because it's just a conversation. And what's interesting, and I'm sure all of you, if you've had that experience, when I give my testimony, even to someone who's Jewish, somebody who's very religiously Jewish, none of them have ever responded, "Oh, that didn't happen to you," because it did, and they know it did.
Mm.
And sometimes it resonates with people, other times it doesn't. But, for those, if you don't know the script, you have your testimony. God changed my life. He brought me from death to life, like all of us, and that we give him the glory for it. So I'm just going to open just a little bit about myself, not a whole lot of detail. I've been married 35 years to my wife, Amy. We have one son who's married. We became grandparents last month for the first time.
Oh,
I'm retired
I
from,
envy you. we, we are not grandparents yet. Okay.
yeah, yeah. Well, they did it right. They were married a year ago, May. They took their honeymoon to Greece in September of last year, where they conceived. They bought a house in October, and now they're parents, and very good parents too. We're blessed. Excuse me. And just some of the passions of my life that have sort of been themes and what I've really enjoyed. Excuse me. And one is sharing my faith. And I want to tell you what really initially motivated me to sort of take more risk and share my faith. And this is going, so back when I became a believer, a Christian, I worked at the ocean front here in Virginia Beach. And for a teenager to work on the ocean front, super duper. And I would try to share with some of the people I worked with. I was a bellhop at a hotel. And there was a Jewish woman who worked in the office. Now, I shared with some of the people who I worked around, but I never shared with this woman. I'll mention her name because she's passed away.
Mm.
Her name was Marcia. I'm losing my voice. Hold on a minute.
Yeah.
So I never shared with her. And then a few years later, I was in a church service and I'm there waiting for the service, and Marcia walks in. She sits down. We go through the service. And then after the service, she comes up to me and looks me straight in the eye and says, "John, why didn't you tell me?" And I keep that in my mind. If people get, how I'm going to risk with this person, how they're going to react, I don't want to hear that again. Why didn't you tell me?
Mm.
And I don't do it perfectly, but God has used that as a motivator in addition to scriptures. To if you love somebody, you want the best for them, and the best for them is a relationship with God through Jesus, of course. So I just wanted to mention that. Excuse me. I worked for the Department of Navy as a civilian for 37 years. I retired a few years ago. And that was because of that career. I was going to Europe a lot, to the naval installations, UK, Egypt, all these places. So that was a real blessing. My other passion is ancestry, and especially my own Jewish ancestry. And I've made connections with many, many Jewish cousins. Several I was able to share with, and some came very close. I got them to read the New Testament. I got them to acknowledge that Jesus was a very special, person in this world. But when it came to deity, that was the stumbling block. And that's something only God can reveal to a person, probably, as you know. We do have a few Jewish cousins in our family who are Christians. And most recently, I think 2 months ago, a cousin called me. I've been sharing with her, and she accepted Christ. And I won't mention
Wow.
her name here on, but yeah. So, God's working in amongst the Jewish people. So let me go ahead and get into my testimony. And in order to do this, I'm going to share some things about the Jewish faith, Judaism, Jewish history, because all this comes into play. So growing up, and as I mentioned to Rob before this, that We all in a family, everyone has a little different perspective of what family life is like, what your parents are like. It's almost like the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's a little different perspective. So I'm bringing mine, which that's all I can do. And Rob may think, well, I know he won't disagree because it is how we grew up. So, in case you didn't know, and as you know this by now, so our mother was Jewish. She married our father in 1946. He was not a Jewish person. And then they had us, we sort of were raised in what's called, are you familiar with Reform Judaism? So I'm going to explain that. So basically, especially back during the 40s and 1950s, there were three branches of Judaism. The Reform, which is very liberal, it was more ethical teachings. They didn't believe that the Torah was the word of God. It was more of a history of the Jewish people. No real relationship with a living God because they just didn't believe that they're, they said, well, there's sort of God up there. If you ever see Fiddler on the Roof, his attitude, he's sort of up there somewhere, but we're not sure what he's doing. And on the other side are the Orthodox Jews. And the Orthodox Jews believe that the scriptures, I'll say the Hebrew scriptures because they wouldn't say Old Testament, that that it is the word of God. They believe literally that God gave the Ten Commandments to Moses at Sinai. They believe you can pray to God directly. They're very much on keeping the commandments, keeping in the word, in the Torah, in the Bible, keeping kosher, praying regularly at the synagogue. You have to live, if you're Orthodox, you're supposed to live within walking distance of the synagogue because that's considered work. It gets to be a little extreme in what they consider work and not work. But anyway, that's the other side. There is conservative, which is sort of a mix of the two. But I don't think probably need to go into that much detail. So we were raised Reform, and I'm sorry. No, if you can stop me at any time if anyone has a comment or question. Go ahead. Anyone? No, I thought
we
somebody.
we are listening.
Okay, okay. So, we grew up in the Reformed Synagogue, first in Richmond, Virginia, and then in Norfolk. I had a bar mitzvah there in 1970, which I can explain a little bit later. But the one positive thing about all the synagogues, especially the Reform, is that they inculcate into you to honor your parents and to honor and respect your teachers. Now, that's a big thing. And it explains, I think, in part, and I know this is more than just, Jewish people tend to be very well educated, very intelligent. And I'm not saying that to boast because there's a downside to having that intelligence, which I'll explain in a moment. Um, Jews make up what? 0.2% of the world's population. They earn 30% of the Nobel Prizes in physics and medicine and such. But a lot of that is the family upbringing, very close knit families, and the education. Jewish immigrants came to this country penniless, and then their children went to university, went to medical school, and these sort of things. So it's a two-edged sword because so many that I try to share with, when they're really, really brilliant, they think they got it all together. They say, "Oh, I figured it out," whatever that means. They never really can explain to me. "Oh, I'm an atheist and I know." And so that's the two-edged sword with the Jewish people. So I just wanted to mention because I don't want to criticize any branch of Judaism. I respect them, and that's what I sort of got from the Reform Synagogue. So I'm going to tell you about my first awareness of God. And this was age 4 or 5 years old. And what's interesting was I really hadn't at that point gone to synagogue where I would have even remembered anything they would have taught about God, even though it would have been limited. So I have a memory at 4 years old, 5 years old, I would get a bucket, put dirt on in it, and put flowers on it and try to offer that to God as a sacrifice. Now, that was a relief to the cats and dogs in the neighborhood that I didn't try to give as animal sacrifice, but so it was almost like a pre-God kind of a thing. And I know that had to be God putting that into my heart.
Mm.
Where would I have got that notion? And so that's, I think, where God was beginning to stir things into me to, in a sense, pursue him. Um, Now, unlike my brother and sister, I was much more interested once I got older and into the synagogue. I know Rob wasn't interested. My sister had a confirmation of some type. Um, but I think what kept me there was learning Hebrew. So, because I went to Hebrew class, I mean, it's pretty neat when you're 8 years old learning this language, this ancient language. And then I had all my Jewish friends there. So that's really what kept me, I think, interested in Judaism during my elementary school years. And like before, when I was just had the awareness of God, I didn't really have a name for him.
Mm.
And this is an interesting thing too, because when I talk to people, maybe you do as well, and they'll say, well, I sort of believe in a God. And I say, well, unless it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I say it in a nice way, it's really a fabrication of your imagination. It's not real. But I say that in a different way that I'm telling you, and I know you all could understand that. So in synagogue, then I identified who God was, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he's the God of the Old and New Testaments. That's the God. So let me see here. So what was going on in my mind is from that awareness, from hearing about who God was, my question was, can I know this God? How can I know this God? And of course, I'm in a Reformed synagogue where they don't even mention God being someone you can have a relationship with in a personal level. And of course, when you're a little boy, as shy as I was, I never even thought to ask the rabbis, well, how do I do this? So anyway, life goes on. And at about 10 years old, I had another awareness of God in a different way. Our father bought us a telescope and began stargazing. So I remember looking at the heavens, seeing the planets and the stars and thinking, wow, God created this big God. Can I know him? So that's the question that was going on. And that stayed with me. I'm just got a few notes here so I can not miss anything. Um,
Okay.
so a funny thing about elementary school, so I did hear Jesus' name occasionally, usually in profanity,
Mm.
but
Yeah.
a Jewish cousin of mine in elementary school, they would have these Christmas programs, and even the Jewish students would participate. So maybe we're singing, one of these Christmas songs, and my cousin and I would mouth every word until it was Jesus, and we just moved our lips. I had one instance of anti-Semitism. It wasn't very bad growing up, but there was a boy who once called me a Christ killer.
Mm.
Of course, I really didn't know what that meant. Then he called me a dirty Jew. I think I was about 10 or 11. So I beat him up, and that was the end of it for a while. So the first real awareness of the living God, God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, um, was when I had my bar mitzvah. And a bar mitzvah is a Jewish ceremony at the age of 13. When you become a man, you're now accountable to God, and your parents are no longer responsible for you. But during that ceremony where I had studied Hebrew, I read directly from the Torah scroll. And at the end of the ceremony, the rabbi, he put his hands over me and prayed over me. And that's the first time I sensed the God of Abraham in a real
Mm.
way. So that goes on. So the next step in our family is when Rob and our sister become Christians. They're living, I think, in St. Pete, Florida. They're newly married. My sister, I'm not sure who first, but they both became Christians and they have their own testimony they can share. So meanwhile, Rob comes back to Virginia Beach and he tells us that about Jesus. Our father didn't respond, or he just sort of listened, and he's got a good story. Our dad, his faith. Our Jewish mother went crazy, screaming, crying, "You're not my children anymore. How could you betray your people?" And for me, I was just sort of open. I wasn't against it, I wasn't for it. And then Rob gave me my first Bible with the Old and New Testament in it. And my mother found it and ripped out the New Testament. And so my brother gave me a pocket New Testament, which I still have. And literally, what I would do, after my parents had gone to bed, I would get under the covers in my bedroom and start reading this New Testament. And it was King James Version 1611, which wasn't the easiest to read.
Ooh. Was it only a New Testament or was it
Yes,
both?
only a New Testament.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I
Smart.
mean, I had the Hebrew scriptures, but
Yeah,
I was yeah.
yeah.
And so what I do, I not only read it, but when I would read it, I would pray to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I would ask him, God, is Jesus the Messiah, which I had some knowledge of as a Jew? Is he the Savior, which I really didn't know what that meant at that time? So I began reading and reading. And then God brought people into my life that helped me. And I'll tell you, I'll tell you a couple of things which are interesting, because Rob got involved with this. So I'm an amateur radio operator, if you're familiar with ham radio. And I just got my license when I was about 14. And I would talk to people all over the world, and they would send what's called a QSL card just to confirm that you spoke to each other. So apparently I talked to Christians because they would send me their card and they would send me Christian tracts. So that's going on. And Rob used that. I don't know how he figured this out. So Rob was back in Florida. He wanted to encourage me. So he would send me Christian literature, which at first our mother would find and not give to me, and she'd rip it up. So then God must have given Rob the insight. Well, when you send him the letter, put his amateur radio call signs on it. So then the mail comes in, there's tracks in there that Rob sent to encourage me. But my mother said, "Oh, it's the ham radio operator." So that's how I was able to continue to be encouraged and fed. The other thing that happened too, which I have to mention, so I was in what's called in the States junior high school. Maybe they call it middle school, but this is basically, 7, 8, and ninth. So initially, I attended a school which was 100% white, and then we had in the States what was called desegregation. So we got sent to another school that was probably half and half, African American and white. And I mentioned this because it was there that I saw what Christianity sort of looked like. And there were some African American students, I'll call them brothers now. In between classes, they would be singing gospel songs. And they had that glowing face and that radiant smile. And I hadn't pieced all this together yet, but I knew that that's what I want. I mean, that's sort of what I want. So anyway, this goes on. And then on May 1973, I got up one morning. My parents had gone to bed, and I had read, Romans 5:1. Therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through Jesus Christ. That resonated with me. I didn't understand it completely, but I accepted it in May, just short of turning 16. What was really great about that week in my high school, I met a real Christian, someone who was really born again Christian. I'm still friends with him. He's a retired Navy captain and so forth. But when we get together, it's like we're 16. And so I thought, how am I didn't even know what I'm supposed to do now. But I thought, well, I guess I need to go to church, but I don't, how am I going to do that with my mother knowing? So my friend, he invited me to stay at his house on Saturday nights. So then Sunday I could go to church without our mother knowing. And when I gave this talk, I've given this talk several times, and at our church, so what was it like to go to a synagogue, to go to a church after a synagogue? And the things that I remember impacted me. There was a lot of wonderful singing, friendly people, and a message that was about God and now about Jesus. So I did that for quite some time with him. So then I'm at home. I'm a Christian, but I'm not going to tell my mother yet. I'm only 16. I don't want my life to be miserable. So I waited until I was 18 before I went off to college. And in the most gentle way possible, I told our mom, and the same reaction, screaming, crying. I mean, she even thought I was going to be the Messiah, which is silly, but that's what she thought. So just want to take a break here.
Okay.
Let's see. All right, turning 18. So I'm going to have to stop because I'm going to have to explain that our mother's reaction was not irrational. And to do that, we're going to talk about our family's history and our Jewish history. So our mother's parents, they lived in Lithuania. This was during the 19th century, and they emigrated with their parents in 1890s or 1880s. So they lived in an area of Lithuania which was called the Pale of Settlement. And what that meant was, and this time it was part of the Russian Empire. So this was an area where Jews were allowed to live. They weren't allowed much mobility. They could not own land. They kept out of the trades. So they did whatever they could do. And typically, and it wasn't even their choice, they would be the middleman between the peasants and the aristocracy. And one of their jobs would be to collect the taxes. So this attitude, well, the Jews, all they're about money, they're cheap and all this. They didn't have a choice. That's what they were told to do. And when the money was flowing in, it was great. When the peasants were suffering or it wasn't, then they were persecuted, expelled from the country. But it gets worse than that. So during the last few centuries in Eastern Europe, there were what was called pogroms. And this is when, so this would typically occur after an Easter service. The Christians in that service would be told that the Jews killed Christ. And they did the loving thing, and they went and they would go to a Jewish shtetl or village, as it was called, burn the synagogue down, and murder Jews. And these were so-called Christians. So, my mother would have gotten that through her family. She didn't experience herself, but that through the ancestry, that's what would happen. So that's pretty tough. And then, of course, historically, you're probably familiar with the Inquisition, with the Roman Catholic Church, and Jews had to be asked questions. They were trying to convert the Jews against their will. That was happening. So then they emigrate here to the States. And you think, oh, it's great. Now we're in the States. But the anti-Semitism didn't stop there. So when Jews came here, I mean, they were allowed to emigrate, but there was discrimination against them in joining law firms, all kind of different businesses. There were quotas to university, especially the Ivy League. And here's the thing, it was limited to 10% could go to like Harvard or Yale or somewhere. But before they put the restrictions on, 30% of the Jews were at those schools. And again, it was just because of the education and so forth. So that's what was happening. And then it doesn't stop there for our family, because we have family who were murdered during the Holocaust. I also know of two cousins. They were digging their graves at Auschwitz when the Americans came and liberated them. And I don't know if you knew about this, Rob, but they actually then came to Newport News, and some of the Jewish cousins helped them find work. And so I mentioned this because At that time, to a Jewish person, there are two kind of people in the world, Jews and Christians. So Hitler, obviously not Jewish. He was considered a Christian. It was not a fault. It was a false representation, but he did use some of the New Testament scriptures, and there were pastors there who supported him. So there was a reason my mother was upset. And so the good news is, in spite of that, over 30 years later, my mother, at age 84, she accepted Christ. It was accidental evangelism. It was her 84th birthday, and my wife, we bought her a Christmas present, and then we wanted to give her something a little extra. So we were in this bookstore, and I think there was a book by Max Lucado. And we just glanced through it. It had nice pictures, maybe of puppies and flowers and all. So we just gave that to Mom. And then a week later, my sister calls. What did you give Mom? I said, what do you mean? I was talking to her on the phone, and she said she's a sinner and accepts Jesus. So apparently that little booklet had, at the last page is where if you want to have a relationship with God, do this. So that was pretty crazy. So I do want to talk just for a moment too about our father. He's just sort of listening to all this. Our father grew up in Indiana. He went to church, but it was a kind of a very legalistic church. And he remembers as a boy, his mother would take him, our grandmother, and pointing at him saying, "You're going to hell." So he didn't have the best impression of Christianity. He fought in World War II. He was in the U.S. Marine Corps. He fought at Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Horrific, horrific battles. He actually, I don't go too much detail, but he was actually in hand-to-hand combat with the enemy, the Japanese, on Iwo Jima, and he was going to be killed. He had to kill them, terrible ways. But he had what would be called combat fatigue. So he really suffered. He felt guilty. He felt bad about what he had to do. He had nightmares for years that we learned in later life. And I mention all this because I'm not exactly sure what age, but I think when he saw his 3 Jewish raised children come to Jesus, that he did too. And he finally found peace with God. So that brings us up now to, so I've gone off to college, and then that's where I started growing as a Christian. Our college had, we had Bible studies, we went to church, and I started growing in the faith. And what's interesting, I've been to many churches through the last 50 years. Every church, I think, even when I visited Roman Catholic Church, there were people who were Jewish who had become Christians in those churches. It's really interesting that way. For a time, we were in what's called the Messianic synagogues. That started like in the late 70s, or early 70s and late 70s. And that's when many, many Jewish people came to Messiah. I expect today there's over 100,000 Jewish believers. I mean, where I go to church now, there's 6 Jewish believers, 2 are medical doctors. So that's basically the last 50 years. And I could end there, but I don't know if you have any questions. I did want to mention a few other things. Like I said when I began, we all have a testimony. And if you know Jewish people and you're hesitant, you don't know what to say or do, you have a testimony to share. And, and in some ways, when a Christian shows love to a Jewish person, it can be even more powerful than just another Jew because, again, of the Christian history where they were so against our people. What else do I want to say? So I've had many encounters with Jewish people. Many will just respond, "Oh, that's nice. That's your journey." One woman started screaming at me, but I didn't mind because I knew she was not a happy person. That was sort of interesting how that came about. And then others, and here's what's interesting too, which makes some Jewish people a little more open and not angry. So since the 1970s, when the Messianic Judaism started and Jews were coming to Christ, excuse me,
Sure.
the Jewish community was in panic mode. They didn't know what to do. Actually, the synagogues here and the Jewish Community Center, they brought in anti-missionary rabbis to just warn the Jewish community. And one quote that they would use that everyone would become horrified is, and they would say, you know what Christianity is all about? And they would read where it says, if you want to serve me, you've got to hate your mother, hate your father, hate your, completely out of context. But especially when you have a close-knit Jewish family, it sounds treasonous. So, but what has changed is, so those adults who began having children and grandchildren, many of their children or even grandchildren, although Jewish, married Christian people. Now, it may not be the born again type, but still Christian. So when I've talked to some people who have grandchildren who are being raised as Christians, even though they can't get mad at me, because what are they going to do? They love their grandchildren, and they're a little more open, which is I found sort of interesting.
Huh.
And what's interesting too, in recent years, I was attending a class at the Jewish Community Center, and there was a conservative rabbi there, and he did mention, I didn't identify who I was. I like to do that one-on-one, not in a group so much. But he did recognize, he mentioned Messianic Jews, and he said, I can understand what the draw is, why Christianity draws Jewish people, because there's a greater spirituality in the Jewish faith. I thought that was an interesting observation. And when I do share with people, if I can go another step, so about 8 months ago, I was talking to a Jewish emergency room physician. He's a medical doctor. And we're talking, and he asked me, where do you go to synagogue? And I said, well, I go to this church. And he said, oh, why? So I told my testimony. And then what I said this, and this is getting pretty bold. It just seems to be something God puts in my heart. So I told him, I said, you know what really separates Christianity from every other faith in the world? And I've nothing against Judaism. And it's the super personal relationship with the living God.
Yep.
And what I also said, what this does for us, of course, now we're forgiven, we're accepted into the kingdom. But because God became a man and suffered more than we could ever suffer in this life, when we do suffer, we have someone who really understands how we are. And I've told him, because I had emergency surgery last year, and I was telling him, yeah, I wasn't worried about it because what I was suffering, God had done so much more. And it gave me comfort. And as a physician, his eyes got huge. He said, wow, that makes sense. So Christianity, and essentially I was saying Christianity offers resources like that no other faith does. I haven't looked at all the faiths, but I've read enough authors who have, and they have the same conclusion.